Our sense of self is constantly formulated, propped up, and recreated by the things we do and by our connections to others. When we find ourselves with nothing to do or no one to be with, our ego has nothing familiar by which to define itself. This is one reason we meditate. When our labels are removed, we can be at a loss. And this is why oftentimes folks have a rough time when they retire and they no longer have the active definition of themselves that they've cultivated for 50 or 60 years. And this is true in other areas of life as well. Can you think of all the ways we define ourselves and create a sense of self in addition to the work that we do? Think about our relationships, our religion, our name, our ethnicity, our gender, political affiliations, geographic location, our body types, our marital status, our education. It goes on and on. So what is skillful, given that we're so busy creating this self? Because we do need a healthy sense of self, but we also need to hold it lightly and be able to see through it if we want to endure on this path to the end of suffering. So this is one of the many reasons we meditate, to be able to sit with those labels and see them and hold them as lightly as possible, maybe even let some of them go. Try to be flexible and mostly be realistic in the face of all the change and impermanence. When we take the time to name and recognize our labels, some are chosen, some are not, we can also recognize the fact that we are a fabricated self, basically. We construct ourselves. And then together, as a Sangha, we have the opportunity and hopefully the courage to explore this unusual characteristic of our existence, the fabricated self. To be clear, having a self is not bad, it's very necessary. And then we might learn otherwise, that sometimes the labels we use, they certainly help societies and relationships function with a degree of efficiency. But these same selves that we create get so attached to their perceived roles, their opinions, and their entitlements. The creation of selves causes deep divisions and fosters ignorance around the truth of our connectivity, that everything and everybody is connected. Seeing my part in this is an interesting Dharma exercise, and one that I hope you'll take part in with me tonight. So some of my own labels that I've noticed, I went from a full-time designer who sometimes meditated, to a part-time designer who frequently meditated, to a full-time meditator and meditation teacher who sometimes designs. So I've just switched my labels all around. I'm still doing it. I'm still leaning on and fabricating a sense of self. But hopefully I have a little more awareness and less attachment to those labels. So I ask you tonight, what are your labels? And how have they changed? And do they serve you? And how seriously do you take them? Tonight, I'd like to talk about the self, and specifically the thinning of the self and not self, or anatta, as it's known in the Buddhist teachings. When we look closely at the concoction of the self, we sometimes can understand intellectually that we are a series of processes, of formations, blood pumping and lungs breathing and eyes seeing, with relationships to other processes and formations that we call people. And this is us looking at the self from the Dharmic view of the five aggregates. And we'll circle back to that in a minute. But first, I need to be honest here. I've really hesitated to approach this subject for two reasons. First, because it's challenging not only to experience it, but to try and talk about it with other people, not self. And secondly, because it's just not the most popular subject. People, myself included, don't initially care much for their concept of themselves being challenged. But this topic of self, the thinning of self, and particularly not self, is a pillar of the Buddha Dharma. According to the Buddha, not self is one of the three defining characteristics of our very existence, along with the fact of suffering and impermanence. So it seems that this is a topic that the Buddha wanted us to know about and make friends with. He taught not self repeatedly, not only to holy men and monastics, but to lay people like us too, which was a radical teaching then and is still a pretty radical teaching now. Tonight's talk is a combination of my own personal experiences of thinning the self, of excerpts from the Buddha Dharma, and of some teachings from respected Dharma colleagues. I've put a few sources in the chat box for the Zoomers. They probably disappeared. We can circle back to that. And I have a short list of resources if anybody is interested in exploring not self further. So, the thinning of the self. It may sound like I'm about to tell you a new way to drop a few pounds. But this is, in fact, a contemporary Dharma term that teaches us how to be less self-involved in a society that focuses a lot on selfies, how to cultivate a lighter structure of self, how to cool down, be less reactionary and less opinionated, and encourage a relaxing of the constant work we do on our self-image. It's exhausting, isn't it? And it basically goes against the contemporary norms in a big way. If we're lucky, though, and if we're paying attention, we may have tasted one kind of the thinning of the self, this feeling of connection to everything and all that is. We may have tasted this in our lives because this can happen anywhere at any time. So a few of my personal thinnings of the self moments have been standing silently in the sun, gazing into the Grand Canyon, looking into a baby's face that is only minutes old, witnessing stars streaking across a dark sky, shedding light that is millions of years old. Close your eyes for a moment. Can you recall a time in your life when you were stopped in your tracks by some experience that was epic? Something that brought you into a temporary state of awe. Feel that feeling in your body. This feeling of awe is so big, so encompassing, and yet somehow it seemed, for me at least, that it was full of intelligence, of goodness. It didn't seem to have much of my day-to-day stuff in it, my calendar, my worries, my accomplishments. None of that was there. What a release. Open your eyes. So we experience this kind of thinning of the self when we're open and willing and available. And of course, we need to be aware of it. Here's a story about that. I'm on a bus one morning in San Francisco. This is 20 plus years ago, and I'm on my way to work. Instead of reading on the long ride, I began to look around at the folks that were packed on this morning commute. I couldn't look at them long. I didn't want to be rude or stare at anybody. I wondered, though, where each of them was headed and who, if anyone, might be waiting for them when they returned home. I wondered if they had children to nurture or had maybe suffered the loss of a child. I saw, and I don't usually use this word, I saw and I felt in my body the preciousness of each person's life on that bus that morning. It brought such an intense energy to me. For a short while, I was able to see with the eyes of my heart, everyone connected as a brother or a sister. And I felt palpable joy, and my heart broke open simultaneously. So where did that come from? Maybe you've had an experience like that, a spontaneous thinning of the self, an alignment somehow with the way things are at that moment. When we have experience of things being particularly illuminated or particularly clear, it usually only lasts a short while. That's what experiences do. They fade, they change, they're impermanent. But these experiences are such great gifts because they let us know in our bodies that there's a state beyond what we experience day to day, beyond our ordinary consciousness. So the paradox about this state of expanded awareness, and there's always a paradox, right, is that as pleasant and powerful as these states of mind and body can be, we cannot keep them. They pass. And furthermore, we're instructed not to grasp after them, but to be content to have had the experience and not mire ourselves in longing or craving for more. So contentment and living with a new embodied knowledge is where we find ourselves. That said, I do think it's true that there are ways to make ourselves more available to these experiences that thin the self. Now, this is tricky because if we operate with the intention of grasping or recreating one of those magic moments, it's a sign that the ego's back in the driver's seat, trying to make something happen, and it just won't work. But carrying an awareness of certain teachings, like the class that just finished on the Eightfold Noble Path, in our tradition, being aware of skillful view, and to live with goodness and virtue, to try for integrity in our actions, and to practice mental hygiene, because our minds will think anything. They're shameless. When we clean house with right speech and right action and right livelihood, we're living in a new and different way. Unwholesome things fall away that used to be interesting and desirable. Now we don't care so much. We have a deeper happiness showing itself through the new way of being. These are the things that position us for the thinning of the self. Another thing that positions us well is the daily practice of compassion for self and others, a heart-opening practice. So I will be remiss if I don't mention the aggregates briefly. They're known as the pieces and parts that make up our human sense of self. And this is from a discourse that Bhante Ji, one of our beloved monks, he gave a talk on this, and you can find it online. The first aggregate is form. That's our bodies. And the Buddha said, all form is impermanent, unsatisfactory, and without self. Second is feeling tones, subtleties of shadow and light in our feelings, and that's pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Some feelings are current and some might be left over from long ago. The third is perception. As we move through these aggregates, perception are the sense pairs that bring us information so we can perceive, like our eyes and an object that we perceive, our mind and the thoughts that we think. All of the sense gates give us perception. The fourth aggregate is mental formations. This is called sankharas or concoctions. These are all the things that our minds generate. It's mental proliferation. This is part of the reason we meditate, is to calm that down. And the fifth is consciousness, which is the animating factor, the thread that ties it all together. So according to the Buddha, these five aggregates are what give us our sense of self. And all of their components are constantly in flux. And so the aggregates are a subject unto themselves. Let's go back to the big picture for a minute. Wikipedia states that in Buddhism, the term anatta refers to the doctrine of non-self, that no unchanging, permanent self or essence can be found in any phenomenon. This is often misinterpreted as a doctrine denying the existence of a self. And this is why this is such a tricky teaching. Anatta is more accurately described, at least by Wikipedia, as a strategy to recognize non-attachment and to notice that everything is impermanent. So see the fleeting nature of things, see your mental proliferation that's constantly coming and going. The empirical self, or the one we have the most experience with, is called chitta in the Pali Canon. This is your mind and heart, your emotional nature, and the development of self in this is the development of chitta. It's called chitta bhavana. Wait, you might say, there's a development of the self? I thought we were disassembling the self. But we must first have a stable, functional, strong, wholesome container, a good sense of self before we set about skillfully dismantling or trying to see through that self. Otherwise, it could be too precarious, too unsettling. We have to be somebody before we can be nobody. I approached this teaching probably 10 years ago before I was ready, and it scared the bejeebers out of me. I just had, I wasn't ready for it. So now is a good time for some of us, and it may not be the time for all of us to approach this teaching. Our main practice of watching the breath and scanning the body is what helps us build a strong sense of grounding that we can return to at any time of the day or night. And these are mostly calming practices for the mind. So this is what we do every day to strengthen our container, so to speak. When we're regular in our practice, we might naturally begin to investigate some of these Buddha Dharma teachings that are not as familiar to us. Teachings like thinning the self, teachings that can lead to understanding and maybe even the experience of not self or anatta. So before we close, let's talk about thick self. And this is going to be probably way more familiar because this is where we live. Self-consciousness, that's thick self, very much aware of ourselves and being in our body and knowing or not knowing what to do. Preoccupation with self-image, sustained self-centered thinking. These are the things that are fed to us in our current society. Reactivity is thick self, where we grasp at pleasant things and push away unpleasant things. Blaming and being judgmental, that's me, I'm right, I know what's right, you need to do what I think is right. That's thick self. There are some aspects of thick self that are more hidden, and they're residues from past difficult experiences, and they might manifest in relatively unconscious limiting beliefs or even traumatic residues. So we can work with these also with mindfulness and our heart-opening practices, but it would also be helpful to combine Western disciplines such as psychotherapy and even. So some dimensions of our social conditioning give us a sense of thick self. They may be related to gender, race, sexual orientation, class, body type, our educational level. All these things can keep us in a sense of self and give us comparing mind, leading us to less than, better than. It's really a way to diminish your joy as being in comparing mind. So in closing, I'd like to share with you what the Buddha taught about self and non-self. He said, in whatever way one conceives of self, the truth is ever other than that. He also said, I am is a conceiving, I shall be is a conceiving, even I shall be formless is a conceiving. Conceiving is a dart and a disease. By overcoming all conceiving, one is called a sage and will be at peace. I'd love to close with a quote from the Dhammapada. When the Buddha was enlightened, he is reported to have said, "House builder, you are seen. You will not build this house again. Your tent pole is broken. This mind has reached the unconditioned and has attained the destruction of craving." So thank you for your attention tonight. Appreciate your ears and your practice.